Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Today, we have Congressman Chris Stewart on our show. Now, Chris is a Republican. He has just retired from Congress, and he has served on some of the most prestigious committees in Congress. He served on appropriations, and there we're going to talk about issues that revolve around a balanced budget. He also served on intelligence, and that is one of the most difficult committees to get on because they want the right type of personality. They allow these members of Congress to literally look at any intelligence that happens in the United States. And what they say about that obviously matters. Chris talks about what's happening in Iran, in China, what is happening in the Middle East today with Israel. He talks about Ukraine, and he also talks about a balanced budget. It is a very thorough discussion, but we start with a discussion about his books. Now, this guy is an accomplished author, and it's worth reading his books. The one that I'd like to recommend to you is The Miracle of Freedom. It's the 7 tipping points that saved the world. It's about all these events that have happened all the way back through history, that had they not have happened the way that they took place, we wouldn't have ended up here. He has other books that are good. Wrath and Righteousness it's almost like reading a spy novel. I enjoyed that. He has a new book that's out that I haven't read yet that's called The Final Fight for Freedom. I will read it. He talks a little bit about it today. But the reason that we start with his books is to try to give you an insight into this individual who has been in a very important position, and to try to give you some understanding of how he thinks before you get to the point of thinking about how does he see the different issues that are confronting us as Americans. Again, you're going to enjoy this show. If you enjoy it, push that subscribe button up front to help us make certain that we get more guests. Or if you really like what you're seeing, go to optamerican.com/premium and become one of our premium members. Now, here we go with Congressman Chris Stewart. Excited to have him here today. Congressman Stewart, thank you very much for coming on the Optimistic American show.
Hey, great to be with you. And, let's talk about something, some topics that, give people faith and hope and optimism. It's in really short supply right now.
I've read a number of your books, and I'd like to talk a little bit about them, especially the first one, which to me was a very optimistic book. It was The Miracles of Freedom, the 7 tipping points that saved the world. If you would, I know that's been a while back and you've had a lot of books since then that are more recent, but if you would you mind just talking about that book, what inspired it, and what maybe was the most important point that you were trying to make in the book?
Yeah, I love that book. And when people ask me out of the, 20 or 20 something books I've written, they say, what's one you'd recommend? I often say that one, kind of depending on who they are and what they're looking for. But I love this idea that if you look at world history, there were events that happened, 2,000 years BC. And it's an isolated event, but you realize if that event had not happened, an easy one is the Greeks defending their nation at Thermopylae. If that would not have happened, then the next event could not have happened, even though it was maybe 500 or 700 years later. And if that would not have happened, then the next event could not have happened. And it ties them all together. You realize that there's this march in world history where events take place, sometimes centuries apart, but each of them were critical to where we are now. And we really are living in a golden age of freedom. And let me illustrate that with these numbers. It's really quite interesting. Demographers have estimated, and this is a very difficult thing to understand and to estimate, but they've done their best, and I have no reason not to accept it. They think that something like 120 to 130 billion people have lived on the earth since the beginning of man. And I know even that is ambiguous. I mean, what is man, and what does that mean? But I think since the beginning of history as we know it, 130 billion people. Of those 130 billion, only 5 billion of them have lived under any circumstances that we would consider free. And of those 5 billion, 3 billion of them are alive today. Many of us look around the world and we think, well, this is how most people have lived. They were able to make their own decisions, choose their own life, live where they wanted, all of the things that we take for granted. And the reality is that a tiny percentage of people have been given that. We truly do live in a remarkable time when freedom is globally accepted and is an ambition for most people. But it's incredibly rare. It's not the experience that the vast majority of humans have lived under, and it's incredibly fragile. And that's one of the points of the book, is that we know in my lifetime, we've seen dozens of nations who have achieved a level of freedom and then turned their backs on it. We're not able to maintain it, or chose by themselves, and we don't want to do this. It's too hard. It's too chaotic. Freedom is incredibly rare and incredibly fragile. And that's kind of the point of that book. And I just love the history of it. I love reading about these incidences I knew a little bit about, but didn't know a lot, and tying them together. It was a fun book to be involved with.
So one of the interesting questions that you posed in your book to me was you started with the Judeans beating the Assyrians and the effect that that had on world history. If you would talk about that a little bit, because I just find that interesting to recognize how freedom actually is connected to Judeo values that happened a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundation of our republic. It's the foundation of this nation, is on those Judeo-Christian values. And it was the first time that any government had been attempted to be founded on those values. And those values were defended because of the historical development of the idea of human rights, the idea of respect for minorities, the idea of even private ownership. I mean, the things that make our culture and our society unique, and extraordinarily unique a few hundred years ago, they didn't pop out of nowhere. Those ideas were cultivated over centuries, over millenniums, really. And it was a defense of, I mean, if we had lost the history and the culture and the values and the society that was embedded really in those Judeo culture, it would not have developed like it did as history passed and as time passed. I mean, again, if you pick a culture or a value that we're known for, when I say us, I don't mean just the United States. I mean Western culture. The truly unique things, I think the most obvious being, once again, the value of human life, the defense of human life. The idea that we're individuals and we have certain rights inherent in just the fact that we are alive, and as I believe that we were created and given these gifts by God. That was at a tipping point when the Assyrians were nearly successful in destroying the culture that was embedded in Judeo values and the Judeo society, the Jewish society at that time. And it was so close. I mean, it was a miracle truly that they weren't defeated, and they were incredibly brutal. I mean, the Assyrians were one of the most brutal cultures that we've ever seen in history. And let me give just one example of that. When they would siege a city, they would go to the surrounding towns and villages around it, and they would kill everyone in those villages. And then they would stack the bodies up outside the gates or the walls of the city, and use these dead citizens, these dead villagers, as a rampart in order to breach the wall. And they did that
Wow.
for a number of reasons. Number one is it's actually practical, but the bigger reason was it just instilled terror in the people who were inside the city, and it just broke down their will to defend themselves. I mean, that's what was at stake in that incident you're talking about there. It's just so critical that culture and that society survive.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I find to be fascinating is you think about the evolution of Judeo values. Obviously, those evolved into Christian values. You move forward even into the Reformation period. We had someone who believed, Martin Luther, that God said there's no one that can be between you and him, that each person deserved dignity. Each person was an individual. I think it's very arguable. Without Martin Luther, there was no Reformation. Without Reformation, there was no individualism that was built into the American society from our very beginnings that said, hey, all individuals have to be valued. Meaning, if God believed that each individual deserved dignity, shouldn't government give them the same thing? And I
Yeah.
think it's often missed the connections that we have to that past. And that while we see freedom as a universal value, I don't think the rest of the world sees it as a universal value. I think
No, there's no,
oftentimes the rest of the world sees power as a more important value or religion as a more important value than freedom.
yeah, there's just no question that's true. And you have to be ignorant of history to not recognize that that is true. I mean, a really good example. Americans love the Roman Empire. We find a lot of faith, a lot of hope in it. That they, they took chaos and built an empire, and they had some of these values. But previous to being influenced by Christianity, they certainly didn't value individuals. I mean, it was common for Romans to discard their children, actually discard infants if they didn't want them. They would literally throw them into the garbage heap, and many of those infants were saved by the Jews at the time. And why? Because they found value in human life. It was just unacceptable for them to think we're going to take an infant and throw them in the garbage and allow them to die. They didn't go find these infants and protect and nourish them for any reason other than that fundamental belief, the value of human life. And it's truly unique through most of history, even in our modern day now. There's many, many places that don't have the same historical background, that their approach to life is just very different than those of us who, are blessed to live in this great land and in the society that we are.
All right, now I'm only going to spend a minute on Wrath and Righteousness, which was an ebook that you produced. That one kind of messed me up. A long time ago, I recall I was giving a speech one time, and one of my staff members had to come up to me and say, "Mayor, what you just told people is not true." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" They said, "Yeah, that was Michener. That's historical fiction." I read about 50 to 70 books a year, and sometimes it's hard for me to discern between what's correct and not. So I try to read just nonfiction. That book was so much on the line between what was really happening and what was being proposed to happen. It was like a spy novel. It was one of the best books that I've read in terms of wanting to get to that next book and read it. But what I liked about it was this whole concept of good versus evil. And I have a question for you just to try to understand your viewpoint on this. Do you see evil as something that's external, like a hell or a devil, or do you see it as something that's internal in each one of us, that all of us have good and evil inside of us?
Yeah. Well, I want to answer that carefully and with the supposition. First off, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not really a religious leader, so I may not be the right person to seek an opinion on this. But I wrote a series of books kind of based on
You did.
that principle as you described here, and they actually were very successful. So I think they resonated with a lot of people. And I guess I would answer it that it's a little bit of both. I mean, I do believe in the presence of an actual evil. I do believe that there's such a thing as Satan, that there is, there is influence in the world that wants to seek violence and chaos and misery and heartache and disappointment, and wants to influence people to take actions that lead to that. I also think we're kind of fallen individuals in a fallen world, and I mean, within our own heart, we sometimes give into those influences. But at the end of the day, I think most people are good people. And even people that I disagree with on some things, I still can look at them and say, in some cases, they're good hearted. We just disagree on this one thing. And I don't attribute to them, that they're evil, that they're bad. And it's a really fine line because, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as I spent my time in politics and in Congress, I've realized there are some people who actually hate our country. And I say that very carefully. I mean, I would not have said that a few years ago, but I realize now it's true. There are some people who actually think our country is so, so sexist, so homophobic, so, the list goes on and on and on. And our history is so tainted with error and with fault that they actually think we should just tear the country down and start over, which I think is utter nonsense. But in some of these people, I think they've just they're just not good people. It's not that I disagree with them on a policy. It's just I realize some of them just genuinely, they just their heart is in a different place. So again, I'm not a philosopher. I'd hate to answer that with any authority, but I think bottom line is it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, to me, it's amazing whether you're liberal or conservative. One of the things that I find to be interesting is like the 1619 Project. Maybe the single most important thing that led to civil rights, equal rights, and human rights was the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that said that all men are created equal and they're endowed upon their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I have no understanding of why any liberal would want to get rid of that as the starting point of this country. That
Yeah.
seems to me to be the one that should be a common narrative that all of us should be able to buy into. It's something that pulls us all together and says, hey, there's something bigger that we're striving for.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I just couldn't agree with you more. And if you can change the history, if you can change the foundation of why our country is unique, or why those who emulate the values of this country in other nations now, as they've done now for generations, why that is unique. Look, two things can both be true. It can be true that the United States is not perfect, and we've never been perfect, and we probably never will be perfect. But at the same time, it's also true that we've recognized our deficiencies and we've tried to change them. The founding fathers, when they said those words, all men are created equal, they actually believed it. That wasn't just something that sounded good or that read well on a piece of paper. They actually believed it. That's why they did what they did and sacrificed the way they did. But at the same time, they also recognize, hey, look, we have a problem with slavery in this country, and we need to change that. They opened the door for that change to come eventually, but they knew that it was impossible at the moment. And again, it comes back to this idea: the principles that we're founded on can be true and can be good and can be real. But at the same time, if your standard is perfection, then nothing is good. Our nation has failings, but it's still good. And again, this truly unique ability and desire within our nation, within our leadership, and within the population, the people, to get better. That's the thing that's truly unique, and that's the thing that gives us a lot of hope and optimism. Is we've gone back and changed things. The civil rights movement, the Civil War, obviously. I mean, allowing women to vote. All of these things were eventually corrected, and we hope we're still on that same path.
Yeah, it's we didn't say that we were creating a perfect union. We were just simply creating a more perfect one than the one
Yeah,
we were leaving. And it
yeah,
it will be a constant struggle, but it's in the right trajectory. I agree with that. And it's part of why I become bothered sometimes by the divides that seem to be happening in this country that are artificial divides. Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? The divides that are happening amongst Americans who oftentimes, I believe a lot of it is perpetuated by a very profitable model where news medias can make a lot of money by constantly trying to terrify their constituency group by what it is that's happening bad to them by the other. But before I get to
yeah.
that, let's talk about the final fight for freedom. I admit I haven't read it yet. It's still on my bookshelf. I'm going to read it. I know that it's your most recent book. Uh, that seems to me to come at the end of your congressional career. You're leaving now as a distinguished congressman that has served on some amazing committees. I want to talk about those again in a moment. But if you would, tell me a little bit about what that book is about and why you wrote it.
It's funny. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with that book. I love the principles that we talk about. I think it's necessary. I struggled, as I wrote that book, to say, do I really want to say these things? Uh, but on the other hand, it's just true. If you talk about my earlier writings, the seven miracles that saved America, and the subtitle, why they matter and why we should have hope. You talk about the miracle of freedom that we've already discussed here. I mean, my idea at my core, at my heart, is optimism and faith and hope in our country, optimism and faith and hope in each other. But at the same time, when I talk to people about that, there's a growing part of me that goes, hey, you got to tell people the truth. We're in trouble. We've got to fix some of this stuff, or we're in for a mess. And I don't want to sound, dramatic or I don't want to sound doomsday, but it's just true. We've got to fix some things, or our nation is going to pay a severe price. And so this book was an effort to try to do that. But at the end of it, we provide an answer. Well, we go through everything from breakdowns in trust in the media to trust in the government to why people feel like the media is just lying to them to why they. I mean, we go through a whole list of threats that we're facing, including many foreign threats. We focus quite a lot on China, as I believe that is truly the existential threat that this generation is going to have to deal with. But we always provide an answer. We always, at the end of it, provide this is how we can deal with these things successfully. But it's going to be hard. So, once again, I am proud of the book. I think it's actually incredibly well researched, and I think it's hopefully well written. But at the same time, I worry sometimes that people read it and they take, I'm afraid that it creates some pessimism, but that's not the point. The point is to point out what the problems are, but once again, how we can fix them.
Optimism isn't determined by people who want to ignore the problems. The simple idea to optimism for me is it's that the people who are going to solve those problems are the people who believe you can. But that doesn't mean
Yeah,
you don't identify the problem. Certainly you do. So I'm excited to
yeah,
read that book, but I want to dig into those concepts a little bit. So you served on the Intelligence Committee. That is one of the more difficult committees to get on. There's a lot of trust that was put into you by colleagues really on both sides to be able to have had that position. There seems to be a narrative that's arising in the United States, and it may be more on the right today, but I've seen it on the left as well, which is you can't trust our intelligence community. Our intelligence community has some nefarious mission that they're trying uh, to to pull off. They're a part of a deep state. Can you give me your view of our intelligence community after serving on the committee, what your view is of them, the role that you think that they play, when do you think they mess up, and
yeah.
are they a force for good?
Yeah, it's a great topic to discuss, and I think it's incredibly important. So maybe two or three elements to that. Number one is you're right. The intelligence. It's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. It's really the most exclusive committee in Congress. It's very, very difficult to be selected and appointed to it. It's a very small committee. And we're told on that committee we have access to every piece of intelligence in the United States government. We can see the presidential daily brief. We're told there's no place you can't go, there's nothing you can't ask, there's nothing you can't see. And you wonder, well, why is that true? Why is the Intelligence Committee given that kind of authority? It's because we have given enormous power to the CIA, to the FBI, to the Department of Justice, to the DIA, to the 17 organizations or agencies that fall under what we call the IC or intelligence community. We've given them enormous power, whether it's the ability to surveil or to observe or to read people's emails. I mean, the list goes on, and most Americans are familiar with that. And we can't give them that power and then just say, well, we trust you guys. Go do whatever you want. I'm sure you won't ever abuse this. So, go about your work and we're just not going to worry or think about you anymore. We learned in the 1970s from the Church Commission, the CIA was abusing this power. Other agencies were as well. That's why the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the same committee in the Senate was created to provide oversight over that. Because if you give government power, they will eventually abuse it. I'm just convinced that's true, and history has shown us that. So the committees were created in order to bridle back these agencies. It's very important that they do that. But look, Americans have lost faith in these organizations. And by the way, it's not particularly the IC or the CIA or some of those that are actually more focused on intelligence. But no question, the FBI has abused their power. And when we are investigating some of these things, for example, and our committee was the one who was responsible for investigating the Russia collusion accusations. And we saw things and we thought, no, that just can't be. The FBI would not go to the FISA courts and lie to them. That's what we thought. And then we found out they did. And then, for example, we thought the FBI would not have someone wear a wire and secretly try to record the president or people around him without a warrant. And yet they did. And we saw these kinds of things, and as we revealed those to the American people, it's not surprising that many of them don't trust these agencies anymore. It's so bad for our society if you have these powerful organizations or agencies that people don't trust. They have got tremendous work to do to try to rebuild that trust, and it's absolutely critical that they do.
How do you think they do that? How do they do that and
Well,
make certain that they're rebuilding it on both sides at the same time?
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's key to this is there can't be this perception that one of these agencies is on one team and not the other. There can't be this perception that there's rules of law that apply to people like you and me, but they don't apply to the elites or to the politically powerful. And I mean, if they want to rebuild that trust, they have to be clear and adamant that that's not what they're doing, and they have to show us that's not what they're doing. And I'll give you a really good example. There were some people in the FBI who unquestionably abused their power. And when you talk to the FBI director about this, you say, well, what's happened to those people? And he says, well, they're still under investigation. And we say, it's been 6 years. How could it possibly be still under investigation? What the director should say is, we recognize that they were abused their authority, and we fired them, and they're no longer with the FBI. That's the type of action that it's going to have to take. You can't hide these things. You can't say and protect some of these individuals like we've seen. The FBI can correct itself, and I think they will. I pray they will. Again, it's so important that they do for the American people not to lose that trust in them.
How do you see people like Edward Snowden?
Yeah, I haven't been asked that question in a while. You used to get asked it all the time. There's some good news and bad news there, and to be very honest with you, most of it is bad news. Edward Snowden is kind of a hero to some folks because he did reveal some of the abuses of some of the agencies. He did reveal that they were collecting metadata, or massive amounts of data, not private conversations or phone calls, but collecting what we call metadata, which is who's calling who, and kind of threading those pieces together. And it was appropriate that the American people know that. I 100% agree. The American people needed to know that, and for Congress to know that, because we weren't even aware of it at the time, and to make a decision, is that the right thing? Let Congress decide that, because we represent the American people. So I actually think that that was good that that was revealed. But here's where it goes to the bad news now. If he had revealed only that, I would feel differently, but he didn't. That's only a tiny sliver of the information that he stole and that he revealed. He revealed highly, highly sensitive things that had nothing at all to do with American people or privacy. It was, some of our most sensitive information regarding our strategies, regarding weapons capabilities, regarding nuclear weapons capabilities. There was no reason for him to take that information, and there was no reason for him to make that available. And it's cost us hundreds of billions of dollars to try to protect ourselves after the information that he released was released. So, again, I support Americans' right to know what the agencies are doing, but he did more than that, and it was actually very destructive to our national security.
Um, if you don't mind, I'm going to flip to Israel for a moment. What are your thoughts about what's happening in the Israeli conflict today?
I've spent a lot of time in Israel. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I actually have friendships there outside of Israel. King Abdullah in Jordan, for example, is a friend and someone I have tremendous respect for. A lot of Americans don't recognize that President El Sisi in Egypt has been a great friend of America, and actually a great friend of Egypt. They have helped to protect them. They've helped to destroy the tunnels, for example, that are funding and are actually providing arms and material to Hamas. And so in no way do I say, well, there's only one good guy and bad guy here. There are other players there that are helping facilitate peace, and I'm grateful for that. Having said that, there is just absolutely no way to excuse what Hamas did in the last 10 days. It's inhumane. It's atrociously violent, and it had no military objective at all. It was to kill innocent people, including, as everyone knows, entire families, taking hostages as young as 2 and 3 years old, and killing not just children but infants. No one can justify that. Now, so I think the more important, I think, element to your question is, okay, Chris, we all know that, we recognize that, but what do we do, or what does Israel do? President Netanyahu is in an incredibly hard spot, a rock and hard spot, as they say, because he just can't have his people live under this kind of threat. But to go into Gaza, as they apparently intend to do, that is an incredibly difficult and dangerous undertaking. It's a very compact area with something more than 2 million people. Most of those people hate the Israelis, not just Hamas, but I mean the population generally is doesn't love Israel, doesn't love the Jews, and doesn't trust them. It's a very dangerous scenario to put your soldiers into an environment like that. There is no easy answer here. I think a couple things we can do is, number one is we need to be firm that Israel has a right to defend itself, especially against such an atrocity. While doing that, we can also try to mitigate and should help to mitigate civilian casualties as this operation goes forward.
So I spent time in Saudi Arabia on a deal with the State Department, and I built up a number of friends there. It seems to me, I mean, one of the things that was clear to me while I was there was that the religious community and the public was always in this constant balance with the actual family and the leadership. And anytime something would pop up regarding Palestine or Israel, it put incredible pressure on the Saudi family to make certain that they were on the side of the Palestinians. I know that we were almost at the moment of a historic accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia that would have maybe changed the face of the Middle East. And I can see what Iran's benefit would be to be involved with this. I'm not so much concerned about whether or not Iran was involved with this. I don't know, because of your intelligence background, whether you could talk about that or not. But I am concerned about what effect does this have as Israel begins to take these actions on our ability to keep other nations out of this conflict?
Yeah. Well, look, there is no positive outcome that's going to come from this conflict. I mean, uh, there's just so much downside to this. You, you talk about the Abraham Accords, and that was a remarkable achievement of the previous generation, one for which they're given very little credit, by the way. But the fact that there were actual peace accords between some of the Gulf states and Israel is a dramatically positive event, and that could have, I think we were close to extending some of those peace negotiations and peace treaties to Saudi Arabia. I shouldn't say peace treaties, it's really something quite different, but the economic ties and just kind of moving forward a friendly relationship. And it's very clear that Iran didn't want that to happen. They want themselves to be the preeminent and the most powerful presence in the region. And if they have to bring chaos and destruction in order to keep themselves in that position, they will. And so they didn't want the Saudis to move forward and have this positive thing. That's only one of their motivations, but it certainly was one of them. I think it's unlikely now that that takes place. I think it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia and Israel continue with these negotiations, and that's too bad. I mean, it's a very unfortunate event that has taken place as a result of this violence.
Yeah, I will say this: the Crown Prince is really hard to get a take on for me. I mean, on one hand, there are things that he's done that have been incredibly bad. On the other hand, he's done amazing things if you believe that westernizing is a good thing for his country, and he
Yeah,
seems to be willing oftentimes to push against the flow. So it'll be fascinating to
yeah.
watch.
Well, just very quickly on that, because I know that there's other topics, but the Crown Prince is difficult to kind of peg down what his motives are. I've met with him several times. He's a very impressive individual. He's very smart. He's done dramatic changes in his society. If you walk around Riyadh or Jeddah, it's so different than what it used to be. I mean, it's remarkable some of the positive changes that have taken place. But on the other hand, he's got one foot on the other side where you wonder too, he's not here to enrich or defend the United States. He's there to protect his own country, and sometimes he takes views that are I think kind of harmful to our relationship. There's no doubt it's a little bit of a two-edged sword there, if you will.
Definitely. Ukraine, if we could just hop to Ukraine for a moment. It seems to be some fatigue, especially on the Republican side of the equation, maybe on the American public side of the equation. But it also seems to be strategically important to the United States for Ukraine to be successful. Can you just give me a take on this and
Yeah.
maybe some ideas of is there any type of off ramp that we may be able to find on this?
Well, I think the off ramp at the end of your question is the most important key. A couple things on this. Number one is the intelligence we had on Russia's intentions was so good. It was one of the examples of the intelligence community 100% getting this right. And that's good and that's impressive. And we need that kind of intelligence because often we don't get that degree of accuracy. And I support and have always supported our efforts to allow Ukraine to defend themselves. But here's the thing now. We have nearly destroyed the Russian army. Meeting with President Zelensky, I've met with him again several times, and he often argues, well, you've got to help us because if we don't, Russia's going to attack NATO and you'll be fighting them in Poland. That might have been true 2 years ago. It is 100% not true any longer.
Hmm.
Russia has no capability of threatening NATO. We have literally destroyed their army, their armed forces, and they've proven that they weren't that good in the first places, that their equipment was terrible, their training was outdated. I mean, their training goes back to the 1940s. They've never been able to develop this idea of combined arms, land mobility. That their soldiers and the training they're giving their soldiers. I mean, the list goes on and on. And if that's true, and it is true, there's just no question they don't pose a threat to NATO. It'll be 20 years before they actually can now. If that's true, then to use your word, what is the off ramp? How many people and how long is this conflict going to go on? Because if our goal is to expel all Russians from the eastern part of Ukraine, but especially from Crimea, which Vladimir Putin views Crimea no differently than he views Moscow. And the vast majority of people inside Crimea consider themselves to be Russian. They've been part of Russia for more than 200 years until the 1954 when they drew a line and just arbitrarily said, you're now part of Ukraine. That makes that very, very complicated. And I think the conversation now should shift to where does this end? And what is a positive outcome? How can we begin to negotiate some type of peace settlement? We've done what we wanted to do. Ukraine did what they had to do. They did destroy, by and large, Russian forces. And having done that, now, well, then, how long will the conflict continue? And isn't it time, I would argue, for us to begin putting forth ideas that say, let's try to end the violence and try to find a solution now.
All right. You also served on appropriations, I believe. To me, one of the single biggest concerns that I have is our federal deficit, the ballooning deficit. A long time ago, I was on the Concord Coalition. I've always been a believer that we ought to have some type of balanced budget amendment, but that in itself is a Herculean task. I don't know that we can get through doing it. We hear all the time about the importance of returning to the regular order, going back to doing these bills through the 12 different appropriations as opposed to through a QR at the end.
Yeah,
Why can't we do that? What's the
yeah,
problem to making that happen?
yeah. Again, it's a great question. I wish we had all day to talk about it because it's a very, very involved question. And I'm only going to be able to very, very much skim the surface, if you will. Republicans have been committed to what you called regular order and passing the 12 appropriations bills, and by and large, we have. When we've been in the majority, uh, not every time, but most of the time, we've actually passed all 12 bills, and sometimes we pass maybe 8 or 9 of them. In some cases, we haven't been able to pass them all. The problem is, even though we pass our appropriations bills, if it goes to a Democratic controlled Senate, or, when I was first elected, President Obama was the president and Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader, of course, they have completely different priorities. And so they actually don't pass their appropriations bills. They weren't at that time. And that's what jams us with these huge omnibus bills because we pass our appropriations bills. They sit there, we'll pass them generally by August. They sit there through the fall. And then in a crisis, because we're going to shut the government down, we pass these obnoxious omnibus bills. All of us want to get away from that. At least conservatives and Republicans generally do. But it's very difficult in divided government. The bigger question, though, and it's the thing you started out with, is why does it matter? Because we have to control our debt. when we've talked about China and the threat of China, we've talked about Ukraine, the threat of Vladimir Putin choosing to use tactical nuclear weapons. We can talk about Kim Jong Un in North Korea. We've talked about the Middle East. All of those are concerning, but you have to talk internally as well. And one of them is our debt and our spending. It's beyond insane. And people say we're going to kick the can down the road to our children, our grandchildren. No, we're not. There's no way in the world this gets to our grandchildren. I don't think it gets to our children. This will correct itself in the near term if we don't show fiscal restraint. We can't borrow $2 trillion a year and think we can keep doing that forever. We can't do it for a decade. I don't think we can do it for any number of a short term, like I said, 4 or 5 years. Whatever the time frame is, it will correct itself. And I'm so glad you brought that up because it's a critical issue that often gets overlooked and ignored, including, unfortunately, by some of our Republicans. I mean, I got close to President Trump. I worked with him on a number of things, but I was frustrated that the previous administration didn't seem concerned about our debt and our spending, and we should have been. As conservatives, we should have been more willing to discipline ourselves in the spending.
Yeah, I would tell you that liberals and conservatives should both be concerned about it. It's at the end of the day, don't kill the golden goose. You know, I mean, my own personal opinion is that most of the great changes that are going to happen, that are going to improve the human condition, are going to come from the private sector. You know, creating driverless vehicles, curing cancer, extending human life. Those are all going to be, for the most part, private sector initiatives. That has a challenge when we're competing for capital with the
Yeah.
United States government driving up interest rates. But much more risky than that is that you crater the system. Today, people are buying the debt, but it just takes that one day, that one tipping point where they decide not to buy the debt and everything begins to change.
Yeah.
I really applaud you on that. I know that you've been on that side for a long time.
Yeah.
Keep forcing that issue.
Well, 2 points, if I could, very quickly. Number one is, what if I were to tell you, as I'm about to, that in sometime in the next 2 years, we will spend more on interest than we do on defense.
Wow.
Then the entire national defense, we're going to spend more on interest sometime in the next 2 years. And that, I think, is a great illustration of the crisis we're facing. And then your point about we reach a tipping point and people quit buying our debt. There's a great line, I think it's Hemingway, I'm not sure, but he says, how did you go bankrupt? He said, well, slowly at first, but then all at once. And that's what this is going to be. We're going to think the world hasn't changed, and then suddenly it's going to change. It's going to be all at once.
Okay, so last two questions, Congressman. Thank you very much for being on. I'm also concerned about how we demonize one another, how Democrats demonize Republicans and Republicans demonize Democrats. And some of that, you know, it's just campaign rhetoric and it's going to happen. But what do we do to try to get our political leadership to cross the aisle and work with one another again?
Yeah.
And maybe the answer to that is we don't get to see where that takes place. It's not being exposed.
Yeah.
I just love your input on that.
Well, a couple of things. In this case, it's an example of where Congress and politics really does follow society. Congress isn't divided, and we don't demean others, and then society does. I mean, society is doing it already, and so it's deeper than just a political problem. It's really kind of embedded in our society now to demean, to threaten, to harass, to not respect and recognize that, like I think most Americans believe, we're all children of the same God, and we should treat each other that way. But we're in these very deep philosophical battles about what really does it mean to be America? What really does it mean to be free? How much power should the government have? I mean, the list of these issues goes on and on. And because these questions are so fundamental to us as society or to us as a government, and because people hold such different views on this, it's inevitable that we have conflict or heated discussions because of that. And because that is true, that should make us more willing, more in kind of leaning towards lowering the temperature because the environment is already going to heat it up. We should try to lower it, not go with that boil and not make it worse. I wish I could say that I had a silver bullet, something that would change this. I think it will change as time goes on and we resolve some of these really deep divides that we have. But like for example, if you were to read or hear some of the things that people say to me, I mean, you would just roll your eyes. You just think, well, how do you respond to that? And the answer is, I don't. I don't pay any attention to it. I couldn't. But that can't be the answer because some people can't not pay attention to it, and some people are deeply impacted by it. And I mean, really, just a little kindness would go a long, long way in this world.
Yeah, kindness. Okay, so here's my last question, and it's going to be about what you're optimistic about in America after leaving Congress. I'm going to give you my point of view first. Sometimes it's hard to look at all the fighting and the problems that we have and try to see some type of light at the end of it. For me, I think there is a common narrative for Americans. I think that we found it in the Declaration of Independence. We enshrined it in the Constitution. And that was the idea that, government's done a lot of amazing things. We built roads and bridges and built a great defense system for the United States. We put a man on the moon. But the greatest thing our government ever did is it empowered the individual over itself. And that empowerment of the individual encompasses both liberal and conservative ideas. We oftentimes talk about the First Amendment, the idea that we have freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of religion. But in the Fifth and 14th Amendment, we also created freedom up for property rights, the ability to own what it is that you create. That became the backbone of free markets. All of those things focused on the individual. For me, when I cut all the way through it, I'm optimistic because that Constitution's still there, because we have a court system that still enforces it, and because we have people like you who come from a side. There may be issues that you or I might disagree on, but I think you want something better for America and for our kids. You've been there now for a while. You've watched this in appropriations and intelligence. You've watched our foreign policy. There are big issues with China and Russia and kind of this authoritarian axis that's there. A lot of it can be terrifying to Americans. What's the thing that you're leaving with that leaves you at least somewhat optimistic?
Yeah, well, we should be optimistic. And I think you said it very well. So let me just emphasize two things that you've already said. Number one is we've gone through hard challenges before. We talked earlier about we were an imperfect nation, but we tried to get better, and we did. And we've been through deep crises before, things that even in the midst of these challenging times, hard for us to imagine. Hard for us to imagine the Civil War. Hard for us to go back and even see the conflicts our founding fathers had immediately after the Constitution was ratified. Hard for us to imagine the Great Depression. I mean, we've been through hard challenges before, and we sustained ourselves, and we actually, again, it sounds trite, but it's true. We actually came out stronger as a nation and as a people after most of these challenges. So I have deep faith in the resilience and in the goodness of the American people. And the second thing I would emphasize that you said, and that is when we say we love our country, we're not saying we love the current administration. We're not saying we love Congress. We're saying we love the idea of the Declaration of Independence, that we love the idea of the Constitution and the government that it created. Those are the things we love and respect. Those are the things that we want to defend. And too many times people say, well, I don't like the current president, therefore I hate my country. Well, that isn't our country. Presidents will come and go. Policies will change. Sometimes we'll like those policies, sometimes we won't. But the principles of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence don't change. They're eternal and they're true. And because they are eternal and they're true, I think we still should have hope. Look, we've got to fix some of these things. I've already said that, but I think we can. And with that, that's why I have optimism and hope.
There is nothing I could add to that. That was inspirational. Our goal is to try to help restore the American spirit. Congressman, you just did a little bit of that here today, and I know you did a lot of that in your career. Thank you so much for coming on The Optimistic American, and Godspeed.
Yeah, it was fun to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks. The interview that we had with Congressman Chris Stewart partly happens because they see the amount of subscribers that we have. It's important to push that subscriber button if you can and know why it is that we're here. We are here to try and help rekindle the American spirit. Look, I'm bringing on people that are Democrats, Republicans, independents. I'm bringing on people who are authors, folks who are talking about why it is that they're optimistic about our country. Sometimes the things that they'll talk about are controversial or maybe you'll disagree with. We always appreciate your opinions, even if you disagree with us. Go to that comment section and give us your comments. In fact, give them to us especially if you disagree with us. Thanks again for being here with us on this show. This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Thanks for joining The Optimistic American show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.